Hello again, Econ 160, and welcome to another video lecture. Today we will be talking about externalities. So last lecture we talked about why governments get involved in markets for public goods and common resources. But you don't have to look very far to see that government is also involved in many private markets. For example, the government involves itself in the market for automobiles, which is a private good, through a patchwork of different environmental regulations. So why should the government get involved in markets for private goods when we already showed that these markets are efficient? Is it just foolhardiness or maybe a desire for political control? To answer this question, let's consider again a private market and how market participants can benefit from it. And let's consider the market for coal-burning electricity. The market participants are the producers and the consumers, and the producers benefit in the following ways. The owners of the coal plants, they make money off their profits, and the workers at the coal plants, they make money from the wages that they earn. And then the consumers, they benefit from the market from the electricity that they purchase, which they value more than the price that they pay. But are the market participants the only people which are affected by the market for coal-burned electricity? Well, the answer is no, because burning coal produces sulfur dioxide and nitrous oxides that can cause respiratory illness. And so people who are living near the coal plants are going to be harmed by the production of electricity in ways that aren't being compensated by the market. And burning coal also produces carbon dioxide, which can affect the Earth's atmosphere. And so people all across the globe are affected by the production of electricity, again, in a way that the electricity market doesn't directly compensate. And so what happens if there are people who are affected by market activity, but who don't get any form of market compensation? And what, if anything, can we do about that? So those are the questions that we're going to be addressing in this lecture. So here are today's learning outcomes. By mastering this lecture, you should be able to first explain what an externality is and give examples of both positive and negative externalities. Second, explain why unregulated markets will overproduce goods that generate a negative externality and underproduce goods that generate a positive externality. Third, discuss what it means to internalize an externality and discuss ways that the government can get private actors to do that. Fourth, explain what a Pigouvian tax is and how the optimal Pigouvian tax is calculated. And finally, explain what the Coase Theorem is, the conditions under which it applies, and how it addresses the problem of externalities. So here's the definition of an externality. An externality arises when someone does an activity that affects the well-being of a bystander, but the person doing the activity neither pays nor receives compensation for the bystander's well-being. And similarly, the bystander neither pays nor receives compensation for any benefits or harms that they receive from the person doing the activity. And so you can think of an externality as the byproduct of some economic activity that the person doing the activity doesn't feel the consequences of. If the externality is something that is harmful to the bystander, then we call it a negative externality. All right, and it's easy to think of examples of negative externalities. Smoking is one example. Smoking creates a negative externality because when someone smokes, the people nearby are going to breathe in the secondhand smoke, which can cause negative health effects. But the smoker doesn't have to pay any compensation to them. Pollution is another example of a negative externality, one that we already talked about. When a factory emits pollutants into the air or the water, they cause harm to people without having to pay any direct compensation to them, at least not unless the government forces them to. And finally, another example is noise pollution. So for example, when someone has a loud house party that annoys the neighbors are harmed by the house party, but the party's host doesn't have to compensate the neighbors for the harm that he's causing. Not all externalities are negative. If an externality is actually beneficial to the bystander, then it's called a positive externality. And so here are some examples of positive externalities. Vaccination. When a person gets vaccinated, they not only protect themselves from disease, but they also protect other people by being less likely to transmit the disease to others. But the person getting vaccinated doesn't actually get compensated for that benefit that they bring to others, and so vaccination results in a positive externality. Another example is taking care of your lawn. When you take care of your lawn and you keep it beautiful, it benefits all of your neighbors, first by making your neighborhood look prettier, and it might even raise your neighbors' property values. But your neighbors don't directly compensate you for taking care of your lawn, and so it's a positive externality. And finally, education is commonly thought to have positive externalities. When someone gets an education, they not only benefit themselves, but they also benefit the rest of society in a couple of ways. First, they might become better and more informed participants in our democratic society. And second, they might create knowledge in their field of work that benefits everyone else, right? Not everyone might invent a new technology or make a scientific discovery, but everyone in their own small way might contribute to a better way of doing things at work, which benefits all their colleagues in ways that they might not be fully or directly compensated for. In fact, George Washington had this to say about the benefits of a public education. He said that in proportion as the structure of the government gives force to public opinion, it is essential that public opinion should be enlightened. So George Washington himself recognized the importance of having educated citizens in a democracy, and so the implication is that education has societal benefits that go beyond a person's private increase to market compensation. Okay, now let's think about how to analyze a market that has negative externalities. And let's consider the market for coal-fired electricity. Here's the supply and the demand in this market. The units of electricity are given in kilowatt hours. And one thing that you'll want to remember is that the demand curve is also the consumer's marginal benefits curve, and that the supply curve is the producer's marginal cost curve. And let's start by asking a very simple question. What is the equilibrium price and quantity of electricity in this market? Well, that's easy. The equilibrium's right here, and so the equilibrium price is 25 cents per kilowatt hour, and the equilibrium quantity is 5 million kilowatt hours, okay? Okay, but like we said, that's not the end of the story with coal-fired electricity because there's a negative externality. And how can we represent the effect of an externality on a supply and demand diagram? Well, the first thing we have to realize is that when there's a negative externality, the cost to society of electricity production is greater than just the cost to producers. And so in other words, the marginal social cost of electricity production is higher than the producer's marginal cost, okay? And that means there's going to be a marginal social cost curve, which we can draw like this, which is going to be above the producer's marginal cost curve. And the vertical distance between the marginal social cost curve and the producer's marginal cost curve measures the marginal damages that electricity production causes to bystanders. So based on this diagram, what's the socially optimal quantity of electricity to produce? And to answer that, we just have to remember that society's total utility will be maximized when society's marginal benefit equals society's marginal cost. Since the final beneficiaries of electricity production in society are just the final consumers, we're going to use the consumer's marginal benefit curve as society's marginal benefit curve. But since the cost of electricity is borne by both producers and by the bystanders who suffer from environmental harm, we're going to use the marginal social cost curve as society's marginal cost curve, okay? And so if society's utility is maximized when the marginal social benefit equals the marginal social cost, that is going to be right here. And we can see that the socially optimal quantity of electricity is going to be 4 million kilowatt hours, okay? So it's socially optimal to produce 4 million kilowatt hours of electricity, but then we saw that in the market without regulation, it would have produced over here at the market equilibrium, and it would have produced 5 million kilowatt hours of electricity instead of 4 million. So the conclusion of our analysis is that if a good generates a negative externality, then an unregulated market is going to produce too much of that good in equilibrium. And this happens because the consumers and the producers in the market, they don't account for the harmful effects that they have on bystanders, right? When deciding how much to produce, the producers are only going to look at their own marginal costs, not society's marginal costs, and so they end up producing more than is socially optimal. Now let's do an example with positive externalities. Supply and demand in the market for vaccines is shown in this diagram over here. The equilibrium price of vaccines is $3, and the equilibrium quantity of vaccines is 4,000. But now, since vaccines have a positive externality, the marginal social benefit of vaccine consumption is going to be higher than the consumer's own marginal benefits, right? And so there's going to be a marginal social benefits curve, which is higher than the consumer's marginal benefits curve. And the vertical distance between the two measures the value of the marginal external benefit that the bystanders receive from vaccine consumption. And so based on this diagram, what's the socially optimal quantity of vaccines? Well, it's going to be where marginal social benefit intersects marginal social cost. All right, and since the cost to produce vaccines is still simply just the producer's costs, we're going to treat the marginal cost curve of the producers as the marginal social cost curve, but the marginal social benefit is higher than the consumer's marginal benefit. And so society's utility is maximized right here, where marginal social benefit intersects the producer's marginal cost curve. And so the socially optimal quantity of vaccines is 6,000. But as we saw in the market equilibrium, the market would only produce 4,000 units of vaccines, okay? And so we have a less than socially optimal amount of vaccine production in the market equilibrium. And so the conclusion of our analysis is that if a good generates a positive externality, then an unregulated market will actually produce too little of that good in equilibrium, right? And this happens because, again, consumers and producers in the market don't take full account of the beneficial effect that they have on bystanders. And so when deciding how much to consume, the consumers look only at their own marginal benefits instead of society's marginal benefits, and they end up consuming less than is socially optimal. In our analysis, we saw that the main problem with externalities is that people don't feel the consequences of their activity on the well-being of others. People who generate negative externalities don't have to compensate bystanders for the harms that they inflict. And people who generate positive externalities don't get compensated by bystanders for the benefits that they provide. And so if the problem is that people don't feel the consequences of their actions, then the solution is to get them to feel it. So the solution to externalities is to make people feel the effects of the externalities that they create. And so for people who generate negative externalities, we can do that by making them pay for the harms that they cause. And for people who generate positive externalities, we can do that by compensating them for the benefits that they create. And making people feel the consequences of their externalities is known as internalizing the externality. And we can think about the meaning of the words. The word externality implies an effect that is external to yourself, that is outside of yourself, and therefore you don't take it into account. Internalizing the externality means taking that external effect and making you feel it internally so that you do take full account of its consequences. One way that the government can get market participants to internalize a negative externality is to tax the good that's causing the externality. And this is what's known as a Pigouvian tax, or simply a Pigou tax, named after the English economist Arthur Pigou. So let's take a look at how Pigou taxes work. Here's our diagram for the market for electricity, including both supply and demand and the marginal social cost curve. And the equilibrium quantity of electricity was 5 million kilowatt hours, but the socially optimal quantity was 4 million kilowatt hours. And so the question we're going to ask is, what level of tax could we levy on the market to get the market participants to produce at the socially optimal quantity? And so let's think about this for a second. The reason that there's overproduction is because the producer's marginal cost curve is lower than the marginal social cost curve, right? So to get the producers to behave optimally, what we need to do is we need to raise their marginal cost so that it's equal to the marginal social cost. And one way to do this is that we can tax them at a rate which is exactly equal to the marginal damages, right? And in this case, since the vertical distance between the producer's marginal cost curve and the marginal social cost curve is 10 cents, right? That's the vertical distance is 10 cents. We would want to tax the producers at a rate of 10 cents per unit. And what does this do? When we tax them at the rate of marginal damages, we push up the producer's marginal cost curve by exactly the amount of damages. And so their after-tax marginal cost curve is exactly the same as the marginal social cost curve. And now producers are going to produce in equilibrium 4 million kilowatt hours of electricity, which is what our socially optimal quantity was. So to conclude, the optimal Pigouvian tax, which would get the market to produce at the optimal quantity, is going to be a tax rate which is equal to the marginal damages that are caused by the externality. And so the idea here is that we want to raise the producer's marginal costs by exactly the amount of marginal damages that they cause to bystanders. Because if they have to pay exactly for the amount of damages that they cause, then the producers are going to fully internalize the externality and they're going to make the socially efficient choice. And so here are some examples of Pigouvian taxes in real life. We have excise taxes, which are sort of taxes on what are considered sinful products, but really these products also have negative externalities, right? So tobacco has secondhand smoke as an externality, and alcohol has the externality of potentially impaired driving, okay? And so excise taxes are these additional taxes on things like tobacco and alcohol, and you can think of them as a form of Pigouvian taxes to lower the quantity of tobacco and alcohol which is consumed and produced in the market down to more socially optimal levels. Taxes on canned and bottled beverages are also a form of Pigouvian tax, and the externality they're dealing with here is the externality of litter and non-recycling. Now, there are also examples of Pigouvian subsidies. So a subsidy is money that you give to a consumer to help them purchase something that you want to encourage them to buy. And so the idea of a Pigouvian subsidy is to help consumers pay for goods that have a positive externality. So an example of a Pigouvian subsidy is how much of preventative healthcare and especially vaccination is subsidized in our country through the structure of our health insurance plans. And another example is tax-deductible educational savings plans that encourage people to save for their children's education, by letting them put in the money into the savings plan before being taxed. So Pigouvian taxes sound pretty good in theory, but the problem with Pigouvian taxes and Pigouvian subsidies is that they're not always practical, especially if it's difficult to measure the marginal damages or the marginal external benefits that are being caused by bystanders. And if you can't measure that properly, then it's going to be very difficult to set the optimal Pigouvian tax, in which case you may be doing more harm than good if you set the wrong tax rate. And so here are some other ways that governments try to deal with externalities. For the case of positive externalities, one thing that the government does a lot is actually just provide those goods directly. And so we see that in education. The government is one of the main providers of education, at least in American society, through our public K-12 schools and bevy of public universities as well. All right, and so that's part of the reason for that is because we've seen that education generates a positive externality, and so the government gets involved by directly providing it. Another way is through regulations and standards, and so we see that a lot in the environment. The government can try to reduce the impact of negative externalities by trying to force producers to invest in pollution saving technologies and requiring certain types of efficiency standards to address the issue of pollution. Another way that the government can deal with externalities is to try and directly limit the quantity of externalities that are produced. And so in the context of greenhouse gas emissions, there's a system of cap and trade where the government limits the total amount of greenhouse gas that's allowed to be put into the atmosphere by companies. And they do that by issuing a fixed number of pollution permits. The companies can then trade permits among themselves, but the number of permits is fixed, and so the permits fix the amount of pollution which is able to be put into the atmosphere. And finally, another possibility is to actually just do nothing, as long as property rights are well defined. And so I'm going to spend a few more slides talking about this. So why might it make sense to do nothing? Well, the economist Ronald Coase, who is pictured here, noted that certain kinds of externalities tend to be resolved among private parties without any government involvement. For example, loud house parties are usually resolved between neighbors without the government having to step in. And this result is known as the Coase Theorem. It says that when the cost of bargaining is small, and when property rights can be well defined and enforced, then private parties can deal with the problem of externalities without government intervention. And let's use an example to illustrate why that is. So suppose your neighbor is growing a large tree in his backyard and it's blocking your sunlight. And so your neighbor is imposing a negative externality on you. Should the government come in and tax your neighbor for the tree that he's growing? The government would somehow have to be able to measure the damage that your neighbor is causing you, and that seems like a lot of work, and not to mention the result is sure to be controversial. So instead of stepping in and regulating your neighbor directly, the government can simply assign a property right to either you or your neighbor. It could assign to you the right to have unimpeded sunlight. And if the government does that, then if your neighbor wants to have his tree, he's going to have to pay you an amount that you'd accept in order to have the tree. Or the government could assign the right to have a tree to your neighbor. Then if you want the tree cut down, you're going to have to pay your neighbor an amount that he'd accept in order to cut it down. Either way, the problem can be resolved through private negotiation. And if the damage that the tree causes you is larger than the benefit that your neighbor gets, then you two are going to be able to work out a deal for the tree to be cut down. On the other hand, if the benefit that your neighbor gets is larger than the damages that the tree causes you, then you'll also be able to work out a deal in which the tree stays up. Let's consider another example, an example of a parking structure that provides easily accessible parking to a group of nearby restaurants. Now, the restaurants benefit from the parking structure, right? Because they get foot traffic from people who are parking at the structure. But they don't have to maintain any of the costs, and so there's a positive externality that the parking structure gives to the nearby restaurants. In order to get the restaurants to bear some of the costs, the owner of the parking structure could threaten to raise the parking fees unless the restaurants are willing to contribute to the maintenance. And assuming the benefit to the restaurant owners is greater than the cost of the maintenance, then some deal should be able to work out without the government having to step in to do anything about this positive externality. And finally, let's consider a third case, and that's the case of thousands of factories across the globe and in multiple countries, all releasing CO2 into the atmosphere and contributing to global warming and climate change. Now, in this case, the Coase Theorem is going to break down. Because there are so many stakeholders, negotiation is difficult, if not impossible. And because the atmosphere is shared by everyone, it's impossible to assign a property right over it to any one particular group. And so when it comes to global warming, the private parties that are involved, which is pretty much everyone on Earth, they won't be able to, on their own, come up with a deal in which the polluters can appropriately compensate everyone else for the harm that they inflict. And so to deal with something like this, where the cost of bargaining is high and property rights are not easily defined or enforced, the government is going to have to step in. So to conclude, the Coase Theorem says that the government doesn't have to get involved every time there's an externality. If the number of bystanders is small, and if property rights are easy to define and enforce, then externalities can usually be resolved by the parties involved through private bargaining. However, if there are a large number of stakeholders, and if bargaining is very costly, or if property rights are difficult to define and enforce, then private negotiation is unlikely to resolve the externalities problem, and the government is more likely going to have to get involved. Okay, so here's a review of today's lecture. An externality arises when someone does an activity which affects the well-being of a bystander, and that person doesn't pay or receive any compensation for their effect on the bystander's well-being. In an unregulated market, goods that generate negative externalities will be overproduced, and goods that generate positive externalities will be underproduced. Third, in order to get private actors to generate an efficient amount of externality, they must be made to internalize the effects of the externality, which means we have to get them to feel the consequences of their actions. Fourth, governments involve themselves in markets with externalities in a variety of ways. The first is that they can do a Pigouvian tax, which is used to make market participants internalize the effects of the externality, and the optimal Pigouvian tax rate is equal to the rate of marginal damages. The opposite of a Pigouvian tax is a Pigouvian subsidy, which is used to get market participants to internalize the effects of a positive externality. The government can also get involved through regulation and through direct quantity limits or direct provision, as in the case of positive externalities. And finally, we said that the government doesn't always have to be involved because the Coase Theorem says that if bargaining costs are low and property rights can be enforced, then private parties can usually resolve the problem of externalities on their own without government involvement. All right, so that's it for today's lecture. Thank you for sticking around till the end. And what we have coming up, we're going to be taking a much closer look at markets, and specifically the cost structure of firms, and how that plays out in competitive markets, and also what happens when markets aren't competitive. I'll see you guys next time.